on the edge of a small town nestled in northern Montana, where tall pines whispered secrets to the wind and snow blanketed the earth for nearly half the year, stood a lonely little cottage. The house, made of cedar wood and stone, looked like something out of an old storybook. It sat quietly where the town ended, and the forest began, a place both beautiful and feared. This cottage belonged to a man named Joseph Parker and his 7-year-old daughter, Elsie. Joseph had built the house himself after his wife, Claire, passed away 3 winters ago. A quiet man, Joseph worked as a forest ranger and spent most of his days patrolling the surrounding woodlands. He was known in the town for his calm demeanor, his deep respect for nature, and his unmatched knowledge of the wild. Elsie was a curious and gentle girl with wide blue eyes and long dark curls. She had inherited her mother's kindness and her father's patience. She wasn't like most children her age. While other kids played with dolls or watched cartoons, Elsie loved sitting by the window and watching the snow fall. She loved stories about animals and often listened to her father talk about the wolves, bears, and foxes that roamed the forest. Joseph always taught her one thing above all else: respect the forest, and it will respect you. Never show fear, never act without thought. Animals feel more than we understand. Elsie listened closely. She always did. It was during the heart of winter that something unusual happened. The cold that year was unforgiving. Snow piled up against windows and buried fences. The wind howled through the trees like a wild spirit. People in town stayed indoors. Fires burned day and night, and animals disappeared deep into the woods. But on evening, Joseph received a call on the radio. A group of hikers had gone missing beyond the ridge trail, and a rescue team was being organized. Joseph looked at Elsie, who sat wrapped in a wool blanket on the couch, a book in her hands. "I have to go for a few hours," he said gently, crouching down to meet her eyes. "Just stay inside. The storm's picking up. Keep the fire going, and I'll be back before morning." Elsie nodded without fear. She had stayed alone before. The forest didn't scare her, not in the way it did others. She kissed her father on the cheek and watched as he strapped on his snow gear and disappeared into the storm. Night fell quickly. The cottage was soon surrounded by white silence. Only the crackling of the fireplace broke the stillness. Elsie sat near the flames, listening to the wind batter the windows and creak through the old wood. She was used to this: long nights, storms, and the distant cry of owls. But then something changed. It began with a sound not loud, but distinct, a soft crunching, like footsteps in snow. She turned her head and looked toward the kitchen window. Nothing then. From the other side of the house, a dull thump, then another. Elsie stood slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She approached the window near the back door, wiped away a patch of condensation, and peered out into the night. At first, she saw nothing, just falling snow and the faint shape of trees. But then her breath caught in her throat. There, just a few feet from the house, stood a large, gray figure, a wolf. Its yellow eyes stared directly at her, unblinking. Behind it, 2 more shadows moved through the snow, then 3 more. In total, 6 wolves slowly appeared, forming a wide circle round the cottage. Elsie didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her small hands pressed against the window pane. Her heart pounded in her chest, but something inside hers, something deeper, kept her grounded. The wolves didn't growl. They didn't lunge or scratch. They simply paced around the house, their bodies moving with a strange calmness. One stopped right in front of the porch and lay down in the snow, watching the window. Elsie backed away slowly, not from fear, but from wonder. What were they doing? Why had they come? She didn't know it then, but the events of that night would not only change her life, but leave the entire town speechless. The wind outside picked up, hurling snow against the windows like handfuls of ice. Yet inside the cottage, it was quiet that Elsie could hear the slow, steady beating of her own heart. The fire flickered warmly, casting shadows that danced across the log walls. She stayed close to the window, barely breathing, watching the wolves move through the snow like ghosts. They didn't behave the way she'd read about in books. There was no snarling or wild barking, no aggression. They were organized, silent, purposeful, like sentries on a watch. Their thick fur shimmered with frost, and their eyes glowed gold in the dark. The largest one, a massive gray wolf with a scar slashing down over one eye, stood closest to the back porch. He never looked away from the house. His presence felt different, not threatening, but commanding. He didn't pace, he didn't sniff, he simply stood, unmoving, as if guarding something precious. Elsie's fingers trembled slightly as she drew the curtain back farther to get a clearer look. She didn't feel panic, not the kind that made you run or hide. It was something more complicated, a strange mixture of awe and a creeping sense that something was about to happen, something big. She stepped away from the window and slowly made her way to the front of the house. As she passed the kitchen, she paused to check the locks. All the doors were secured. Her father had made sure of that before he left. Still, she checked again, her small hands fumbling a bit in the cold. The front window revealed the same haunting scene. 3 wolves stood out front now, their paws buried in deep snow. One was younger, smaller, maybe not even fully grown. Its ears twitched with every gust of wind. Another paced slowly in a crescent pattern, occasionally stopping to sniff the air before continuing its loop. Elsie sat down on the living room rug and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her mind tried to recall everything her father had told her about wolves. They're not monsters, he had once said. They're smart, loyal, and they don't attack unless they feel cornered or threatened. So what were they doing here? She remembered something else, a story he told her, about a lone wolf who had once followed a ranger through a blizzard, not to attack, but to guide him home. Some animals, he'd said, understand more than we give them credit for. Elsie turned to face the back window again. The scarred wolf still hadn't moved. His breath formed soft clouds in the freezing air. Their eyes met. For a long moment, she didn't blink. Neither did he. Then, slowly, almost instinctively, she spoke. "Are you watching me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The wolf tilted his head, ears flicking forward, as if listening. Elsie stood and walked to the hearth, grabbing another log and carefully placing it on the fire. The flames rose higher, casting a warm glow that pushed back the shadows. Then, with quiet steps, she walked back to the window and sat cross-legged on the floor. She wasn't afraid anymore. Curious, yes, but not afraid. Something about the way the wolves moved, the calmness of their presence, the lack of any violence made her feel oddly safe, protected. Even as the hours passed, the wolves remained. They didn't try to get inside. They didn't howl or bark. They just waited, watching, guarding. Eventually, Elsie began to nod off. She curled up on the rug near the fire, the blanket pulled tightly around her. Outside, the storm howled on. Inside, the cottage glowed gently like a lantern in the dark. And still, the wolves stayed. It was just before dawn when the first of them began to move. One by one, they turned and walked away, their silent shapes vanishing into the trees. The last to leave was the scarred grey wolf. He stood for a while longer, gazing into the window one last time. Then he, too, disappeared into the snow. When Elsie awoke, the fire was low, and light was beginning to filter through the frost-covered windows. She rushed to the door and flung it open, stepping onto the porch barefoot. The forest was quiet, but all around the cottage, pressed deep into the snow, were wolf tracks, hundreds of them circling the house like a protective wall, and not a single one crossed the threshold. The cold air hit Elsie's face like a splash of icy water, but she didn't flinch. She stood barefoot on the porch, eyes wide, staring at the endless trail of paw prints pressed deep into the snow. It was like a snow-white canvas had been painted. With the quiet movements of shadows, she took a hesitant step forward, placing her foot next to one of the prints. It was nearly the size of her hand. The tracks went around the house in wide, deliberate loops. Some were spaced out, showing a wolf had stood still for a long time, while others were tight and layered, as if they had patrolled the same spot. Again and again, they hadn't come to attack. That was obvious now. No scratch marks on the wood. No broken glass, no blood, nothing but peaceful silence in those eerie, perfect prints. Elsie turned and went back inside, rubbing her feet to warm them by the fire. As she added 2 more logs, her mind played back every detail from the night before. The eyes watching through the dark, the soft thumps of paws, the giant wolf who never moved. The moment she whispered, and it seemed like they were listening. There had been something in those eyes, not wild hunger, not fear. Something else. Understanding. When her father finally returned, his beard frozen and coat soaked with snow, he rushed through the door, calling her name. Elsie ran into his arms, and for a long moment, he just held her, not saying anything. He had feared the worst all night. "I'm okay, Daddy," she whispered. "They didn't hurt me." He pulled back and looked at her, confused. "Who?" "The wolves," she said. He frowned. "Wolves." She nodded and took his hand, guiding him to the window. The snow outside was bright now under the morning sun. The prints were everywhere, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Her father's eyes narrowed. As he stepped outside, he walked around the house, crouching down to study the tracks. He had spent years reading animal signs, tracking predators, and monitoring the forest. But this pattern, this was different. Back inside, he paced silently, trying to make sense of it. They were here all night. Elsie nodded. They didn't try to get in. They just watched. He stared at her. "And you weren't afraid?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really, I think. They were watching over me." Her words struck him in a way he couldn't explain. He'd seen wolves before, of course, monitored them, tracked their movements, but never had he heard of something like this. A pack surrounding a house without aggression, staying through the storm without attacking it, went against every rule of behavior he knew. By noon, the news had started to spread. He had mentioned the tracks to a colleague in town, and soon a few curious locals came to see for themselves. By afternoon, 3 more cars had arrived. They stood silently, gazing at the prints. Someone took photos. Others just whispered, "It doesn't make sense." One man muttered, "Why didn't they break in?" A woman asked. Her father had no answers. Not yet, but Elsie had a feeling, a quiet certainty, that those wolves hadn't just come out of curiosity. They had come for a reason. She could still feel the moment she locked eyes with the scarred wolf. There had been something deeply human in that gaze, something ancient. Later that evening, when the last neighbor left and the snow began falling gently once more, Elsie sat by the fire again. Her father stood by the window, lost in thought. "They didn't want to hurt me," she said softly. "I think they were, making sure I was safe." He looked at her, then back at the tracks, slowly disappearing beneath the fresh snow. "You know," he said after a long pause, "your mother used to say that wolves could sense a good heart, that they knew who to trust." Elsie didn't reply. She just smiled. Outside, the wind had calmed. The forest, which had seemed so wild and threatening the night before, now felt still and protective. Something had happened, something no one in town would fully understand. But Elsie knew the truth. She had been watched, not by predators, but by guardians. By the next morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Joseph Parker hadn't meant to cause a stir. He only mentioned the tracks to a fellow ranger over the radio. But in a small town like Willow Creek, unusual news didn't stay quiet for long. Within hours, people were driving out to the edge of the forest to see for themselves. The narrow road leading to the Parkers' cottage, usually untouched in winter, was marked with tire tracks and scattered footprints. People gathered in coats and scarves, their breaths fogging in the cold air. As they stood in silent awe at the sight around the house, no one could deny the truth. The wolf prints were there, circling the cottage, weaving between trees, clustered near windows and doors. One man, a local hunter named Tom Harlow, walked the perimeter slowly, his brow furrowed. "This many wolves, and not a single broken pane," he muttered. "If they were hungry, they'd have smashed in through the door." Joseph stood with his arms crossed, watching as people murmured and pointed. Some seemed fascinated. Others looked unsettled. Elsie, sitting inside near the window, watched them without saying a word. She saw how their eyes shifted as they examined the evidence, how their voices dipped when they spoke of the wolves. "What do they think?" she asked her father when he returned inside. He shrugged. "Some think it's a miracle. Some think we made it up. But it really happened." "I know," he said gently, brushing her hair back. "I believe you." That evening, the sheriff stopped by, a kind but skeptical man named Robert Kinney. He had known Joseph for years. He walked around the property quietly, inspecting the scene, then came inside for coffee. "It's one thing to see a few wolves pass through," the sheriff said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "But this, a full pack, no sign of aggression. No one's ever seen anything like it." Joseph nodded. "I can't explain it, Rob, but they didn't come to hunt. They came for something else." The sheriff looked over at Elsie, who sat, curled up on the couch with her blanket, quietly listening. "And you're sure you were alone the whole night?" Elsie met his eyes and nodded firmly. "They never tried to come inside. They just stayed, like they were watching." Sheriff Kinney didn't argue. He didn't need to. The evidence was right outside the window. He finished his coffee and left, with a promise to notify Wildlife Services in case the pack returned. But before the week was over, more strangers came knocking. First, it was a wildlife photographer from out of state, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wolves. Then a journalist. From the regional news, a local paper ran a headline that read, "Wolves surround child's home, leave without a scratch." Within days, the story spread farther. Some people dismissed it as a lucky encounter. Others whispered that the girl must have a gift, something unexplainable. At the heart of it all, Elsie remained calm. She didn't seek attention or interviews. When asked to describe what happened, she always said the same thing. They weren't scary, they were quiet, like they understood I was alone. Her father watched all of this unfold with a strange mix of pride and concern. He wanted the truth to be known, yes, but he also didn't want his daughter turned into a spectacle. He decided to reach out to someone he trusted, Dr. Amelia Rhodes, a wildlife biologist who had studied wolves in the area for over a decade. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. Amelia arrived a few days later, her SUV loaded with gear and tracking tools. She greeted Joseph with a firm handshake and gave Elsie a warm smile. "I've heard your story," she said gently, "and I believe you." Elsie blinked. "You do?" Amelia nodded. "Wolves are complicated and very smart. If they stayed near your house all night without trying to hurt you, that means something. I want to find out what." That night, as the stars glittered over the forest and the last of the curious visitors drove away, Elsie stood at the window once again. The snow had started, falling again, soft, silent. She wondered if they would come back, and somewhere deep, in the woods, where only the trees could hear, something moved through the snow, silent as a breath, watching from a distance. Dr. Amelia Rhodes didn't waste time. The morning after she arrived, she was already out in the snow with her notebook in one hand and her boots crunching softly beneath her. She circled the Parker home slowly, studying the patterns left behind by the wolves. Though most were beginning to fade under fresh snowfall, Joseph walked beside her, while Elsie watched from the porch, bundled in a thick blue coat and scarf. "I haven't seen a wolf pack this close to town in over 5 years, Amelia said quietly, "and never behaving like this." She knelt down near the porch, pointing to a cluster of overlapping paw prints. This was a long pause. "The alpha probably stood here for hours." Joseph nodded. "That's where the big grey one stayed." "Scar over his eye." Amelia paused. "Scar over his eye." Her expression changed slightly, as if a puzzle piece had just slid into place. "You know him?" Joseph asked. "I've seen him in camera footage," she said. "We've been tracking him for a while. Locals call him Ghost Eye. He's the lead of a small pack in the northern range. Highly cautious, never seen near humans before this." She stood up, brushing snow from her knees. "If Ghost Eye came this close and stayed through a storm, there has to be a reason." Later that day, Amelia set out deeper into the forest, alone but equipped with a GPS, camera, and emergency radio. She followed a trail of faint tracks leading northeast, beyond where the Parker property ended and the protected wildlife zone began. It was quiet in the woods, the kind of quiet that comes only after a fresh snowfall, when every tree stands still and every sound is swallowed by snow. She moved carefully, scanning for signs. A few miles in, she found something, a den, or what was left of one. The entrance was caved in, half covered with snow, but the broken branches, claw marks, and tufts of fur nearby told a clear story. This had been a den recently and it had been attacked. Amelia crouched down, examining the evidence. A few pieces of shredded fabric were buried in the snow. One had a faint scent of gun oil. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just predators that had been here. Humans had found the den. Poachers. She pulled out her camera and took several photos, then carefully opened her notebook and began to write. Her mind raced through the timeline. If this was good den, and if pups had been here, she stood slowly, heart heavy. The loss of pups would explain aggression, but Ghost Eye hadn't shown aggression. He had shown restraint, purpose, and if a pack was grieving mourning in the only way wild creatures could, then maybe their visit to the Parker house hadn't been random at all. That evening, back at the cottage, Amelia laid out her findings. "I think the wolves lost their pups," she said as she spread the photos across the kitchen table. "I believe poachers destroyed their den. The tracks matched Ghosty's route from the northern range to here. Joseph stared at the images, a deep frown forming. So they came here because maybe they were confused. Maybe they were searching for what they lost. She glanced at Elsie, who listened silently from the doorway. Or maybe something about her reminded them of who they lost. Elsie tilted her head. But why didn't they hurt me? Amelia gave a soft smile. Because grief doesn't always turn into violence. Sometimes it turns into protection. I think they saw you as something worth guarding. You weren't prey. You were peace. The room went still. Joseph leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as snow began to fall once more. So you're telling me a grieving wolf pack surrounded my daughter to keep her safe? Amelia nodded. Yes, it's rare, but not impossible. There are stories, old ones, and a few recorded cases of animals behaving in ways we don't fully understand. Elsie stepped into the room, her voice quiet but sure. I wasn't afraid. Not even when they looked right at me. Amelia turned toward her. They knew. Animals sense more than people think. They saw something in you. And just like that, the impossible started to feel real. A grieving wolf pack, a little girl alone in the woods, and a night that could have ended in tragedy. But DIDN single quotes T. Outside, the forest stood silent again. But something had changed, and the town would soon realize this was only the beginning of the mystery. The town of Willow Creek had always known the forest was mysterious, but nothing had ever quite shaken them like Elsie's story. In the following days, more people came to see the house, not just out of curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. The idea of a wild wolf pack watching over a little girl wasn't just strange, it was unexplainable. But the tracks, the behavior, the girl's calm testimony, and Dr. Amy Rhodes' findings had silenced most of the skeptics. Still, one question lingered in every conversation, every article, every whisper around a diner table. Why her? Amelia believed the answer might lie in the wolf's grief. But what baffled her was how that grief turned into something protective rather than dangerous. So, she turned to the forest for more answers. She returned to the site of the den with Joseph and 2 colleagues from the wildlife reserve. This time, she brought motion-sensitive cameras and scent markers. She set up tracking devices along known wolf trails, hoping to catch signs of Ghosty and his pack again. Back at the Parker home, Joseph installed extra lights around the property, not because he feared the wolves, but because strangers had started snooping around at night, hoping to see something supernatural. The attention was starting to make him nervous. Elsie didn't seem bothered. In fact, she seemed calmer than ever. Each night, she sat by the window, gazing into the dark trees beyond the backyard, as if waiting for something. Her father often found her there, curled up with a blanket and a cup of warm milk, her eyes steady and searching. One evening, a soft beep from one of Amelia's trail cameras sent her racing into town. The footage had just arrived in her email, and what she saw left her stunned. She returned to the cottage the next morning, laptop in hand. "Look at this," she said, placing it on the table in front of Joseph and Elsie. On the screen, a grainy but clear video played. Snow fell gently over the forest floor. At first, nothing moved. Then, from the left side of the frame, a wolf appeared, Ghosty. His scarred face looked tired, but regal. He stopped in the center of the frame and sat. Seconds later, he lifted his head and howled. The sound was low and mournful, almost like a cry. After a moment, he rose and disappeared into the shadows again. Amelia paused the video. "That was just 2 nights ago," she said, "only a few miles from here." Joseph watched the screen, silent. Elsie leaned forward. He was calling. Amelia nodded slowly. Yes, and the tone. It wasn't a warning or a hunting signal. It was more like a goodbye. That evening, something incredible happened. Just after sunset, Elsie stood near the back door, something drawing her to the window. The trees swayed gently in the wind. She leaned forward, eyes scanning the snowy clearing, and then she saw it. A figure, large and still, stood at the edge of the forest. Ghost-eyed. His massive frame was outlined against the snow. Behind him, 3 other wolves stood silently. Joseph stepped in behind her and froze. They didn't move toward the house. They just stood, watching, peaceful, calm. Elsie pressed her hand to the window pane. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. She just stared at the scarred wolf, and he stared back. Then, slowly, Ghosty lowered his head. One of the wolves behind him stepped forward and dropped something into the snow. It was small, barely visible. Then the wolves turned and vanished. into the trees without a sound. Joseph rushed outside, careful and alert. He approached the spot cautiously, keeping an eye on the forest. In the snow was a small object, a smooth stone with a pattern carved into its spirals, and lines that looked almost human-made. He picked it up and turned it over in his palm. It was warm that he carried it inside, and placed it on the table. Elsie looked at it, and smiled, then whispered, "A gift." Amelia was speechless. There were no more questions now. Something had passed between the girl and the pack. Something no camera could capture, no article could explain. A bond had formed in the silence of that snowy night, and now it had been sealed. Spring was slowly arriving in Willow Creek. The snow began to soften, dripping from rooftops and turning the forest paths into muddy trails. Birds returned to the trees. The town moved forward, as towns always do, but the story of Elsie and the wolves still lived in every whispered conversation, every curious glance, and every quiet pause during cold nights. For weeks, the wolves did not return. The gift, a smooth stone with carved markings, remained on the mantel above the fireplace, right beside a photo of Elsie's mother. Some people who visited said it was just a rock. Others swore it pulsed with warmth when they held it. No one could explain it. Elsie never asked to see the wolves again. Somehow, she knew the encounter had ended. It had been a goodbye, but the feeling they left behind stayed with her like a memory that refused to fade. Sometimes, she still sat by the window, not in hope, but in quiet gratitude. Then one day in late March, as frost still clung to the morning grass, Elsie stepped outside and found something unusual near the edge of the woods. It was her red wool scarf, the one she had worn the night the wolves came. The same scarf that had gone missing weeks ago. It was neatly folded on a flat stone, clean, dry, perfectly placed. She stood staring at it, unsure what to say. Her father came outside, drawn by her silence. When he saw what she held, he stopped walking. "They were here again," she said simply. Joseph looked toward the trees. No movement, no sound, just the same swaying pines and early morning mist. Elsie ran her fingers over the scarf. It still smelled faintly of pine, and something else she couldn't quite name. Not fur, not soil, something wild, but familiar. That afternoon, Dr. Amelia Rhodes returned after a week away on a research trip. When she heard about the scarf, she immediately checked her camera feeds. Most of them showed nothing unusual, just deer, wind, and the slow melt of winter. But one video stopped her cold. On a path near the border of the protected zone, just before dawn, the camera caught Ghosty. He stood alone, scarf in his mouth, and looked directly into the lens. Then he walked forward, slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the rock. He paused, raised his head for one final look around, then turned and disappeared. That was the last known footage of him. When she showed the clip to Joseph and Elsie, no one spoke. The room filled with a quiet that wasn't sad, it was reverent. Elsie nodded once. He came back to finish it. Amelia turned to her. "Finish what?" "The promise." Elsie didn't say more, but her eyes held the kind of certainty adults rarely understand. That moment had confirmed what everyone had started to believe. This wasn't about a lucky night or a strange coincidence. This had been something far deeper. A farewell, yes, but also a recognition. A final act of respect. Days later, the town painted a mural on the side of the small library near the center of Willow Creek. It showed a snow-covered cottage glowing in the night, surrounded by tall trees. At the edge of the forest, a single wolf stood watching, eyes bright with intelligence, and inside the window, a little girl sat beside the fire, unaware of the guardian just beyond the glass. The mural wasn't meant to be flashy or dramatic. It wasn't about fear or danger. It was about the quiet magic that sometimes exists in the space between humans and the wild. It didn't take long before visitors began arriving from other towns. People wanted to see the cottage, the mural, the forest, but what they didn't realize, what only Elsie and a few others truly knew, was that the real story didn't live in the paint on the wall. It lived in the silence of the trees, in the bond formed one winter night when nature decided to protect rather than destroy. Ghosty was gone now. The pack was never seen again, but their message lingered. And sometimes, in the early morning, Elsie still walked to the edge of the forest, placed her hand on the old stone where the scarf had been left, and whispered, "Thank you." Years passed. Seasons came and went in Willow Creek, each one brushing the little town with its unique rhythm. Soft springs, golden summers, windswept autumns, and snow-heavy winters. But through it all, one story stayed alive like a heartbeat. Just beneath the surface, the night the wolves surrounded a little girl's house and left without harm. The Parker cottage remained tucked at the forest's edge, aging gracefully. Joseph eventually retired from the ranger service, content to live a quieter life. And Elsie, bright, gentle, and steady, grew into a young woman, with a spirit as rooted as the trees she had grown up beside. She didn't talk about the wolves often, not because she had forgotten, but because the experience had settled into her like part of her soul. It didn't need repeating. It simply lived in her. As she grew older, Elsie followed her own path, toward crowded cities or noisy streets, but deeper into nature. She studied animal behavior and wildlife conservation, eventually becoming a specialist in predator-human interaction. People often asked what inspired her. She always gave the same answer with a soft smile. I was protected once. Now I try to return the favor. Though the wolves were never seen again, their presence lingered. Some nights, hikers near the northern range claimed to hear a single howl, long and low, echoing through the hills. Others reported glimpses of movement between the trees, but no one ever got close. Still, their legend grew. The mural on the library faded over the years, but was carefully repainted by local artists. Children whispered stories about the forest guardian with the scarred eye. Tourists came not just for the lakes and trails, but for the tale of the wolves and the girl who sat by the fire without fear. Eventually, Elsie wrote a book, not for fame, but to preserve what had happened. It was called When the Wolves Watched, and it focused not on the miracle of survival, but on the strange connection between grief and grace. She wrote about Ghosty, the night of the storm, and the carved stone left behind. The book reached far beyond Willow Creek, sparking conversations in universities, wildlife circles, and quiet family homes across the country. People cried reading it. Others simply sat still, thinking about what it meant to be seen by something wild and spared. In time, the area near the Parker cottage was declared a protected sanctuary. No hunting, no trapping, just quiet woods, safe paths, and an invisible promise that nature and humanity could sometimes find peace. Elsie stayed near the forest, living in a small cabin she built herself just a mile from her childhood home. Her father, now older but still strong, helped with the garden. Sometimes they walked the familiar trails together, sharing long silences and occasional glances that said more than words ever could. One morning, in early winter, Elsie returned to the stone at the forest's edge, the same one where her red scarf had once been left. Snow fell gently, just enough to dust the trees and soften the world into a hushed dream. She knelt beside the stone and placed something on top of it, a letter in a small waterproof pouch, tied with twine. Not for people, not for cameras, for the forest, for them. She stood there for a while, eyes scanning the tree line, not expecting to see anything, but hoping in a way that wasn't desperate or sad, just open. And in that moment, with the snow falling, a breeze passed through the pines. It stirred her hair, it rustled the leaves, and in that gentle hush, she could have sworn just for a second she heard it. A howl, soft, far away, but real. She smiled, then turned and walked back toward home. And so the story of the wolves and the little girl became more than a tale. It became a part of the land itself. It reminded people that not everything wild is dangerous, and not every silence is empty, that sometimes protection comes from the most unexpected places, and that even in grief, a heart can choose gentleness. Elsie never saw Ghosty again, but she never needed to. He had seen her once, and that was enough to change everything.